All right, well, it was our top story at noon to start off Newsday. It's the Treasurer. He's done a speech today. It's been splashed in the various newspapers, presumably with a controlled leak from his office, that they will be looking at income tax cuts as a key election policy at the next election. Unsurprisingly, well, the issue here, of course, is it something that can be afforded by the government? Is it something that will be sufficient to deal with bracket creep, and what, if any, stimulus might it have for the economy in terms of creating incentives for people who are obviously earning an income? Let's find out what Labor's reaction is with Ed Husic, Parliamentary Secretary, Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for the Labor Party in the terms of Treasury. What do you think? Good idea?
After spending the bulk of, the last 2 years saying there was no money in the cupboards, to be able to suddenly say that they're going to take to an election a commitment to reduce tax, I mean, how does it pass the believable test? I don't think
you don't think that they'll actually get there? Christina Keneally, on To The Point, was rattling off all the dates in which Joe Hockey has made sort of promises of this order before, and she speculated that we won't see anything substantive in this term of Parliament announced. Do you agree with that?
I figure the biggest problem that Joe Hockey has is getting anyone to believe anything that the Liberal Party say when it comes to election commitments. I mean, they smashed a whole lot of them in the first budget, and they severely dented their credibility, and part of the reason, or the big reason why they're in trouble electorally, is because of that. And for them to now say that they'll be in a position to actually deliver tax cuts, again, I just think based on record, I don't think it's believable.
They'll give us something. The issue, though, is the size of it. I mean, my criticism, if there is to be one, is that it might end up being so puny that its impact is ultimately negligible, because they're trying to ensure that the impact on the budget is negligible.
So the next point flowing from that would be, wouldn't you want to manage expectations better? They just, in the space of the last week, agreed to a change to the GST threshold, driven largely by demands on revenue, and now, after having raised or broadened the GST out in that way, they're now saying they'll deliver tax cuts elsewhere off the back of, increase in petrol indexation, proposed changes to the GP, way in which GPs charge the GP tax. I just don't see it's going to be seen as credible. And then the issue becomes, if it's very small or puny as you described it, it just basically risks further alienating the general public.
I put it to the Treasurer that for it to be a sizable income tax cut, they might need to look at other tax reforms such as the GST. He wouldn't bite. Labor just rules that out holus bolus, doesn't it? There's no discussion to be had on the GST?
We've outlined, and you and I have had this discussion, at times very heated discussion about tax reform when it comes to the GST. It's not really reform, it's just hiking up the GST.
Well, it's reform if you do other things at the same time.
And, well, the other thing is that, they're effectively getting the states to make the case by forcing their hand through the cuts, massive cuts on schools and hospitals funding. And, again, how can you plausibly talk about doing that? How can you plausibly talk about personal tax cuts when you're doing that in the background, plus impacting on people generally? And in my area, the thing that really stands out for me is, Mount Druitt, that I represent in the seat of Chifley, is the worst affected based on NatSem analysis when you look at the impact of the federal budget. So, I worry about what impact the people I represent have, or what load they have to shoulder in any reform that's put forward.
But you're a member of the executive now. You've got to think more broadly than that. That's your role as a representative. But look, be that as it may, what about this, though?
How does Barnaby Joyce get away with it?
Well, yeah, that is true. No, that's fair criticism, and I've levelled that at him as well. But here's the issue. The Labor Party in 2007 was, in a sense, teased into supporting tax cuts that ultimately, because of the GFC and other things, became unaffordable, really. You proceeded with most of those in government. If you hadn't proceeded with those, the size of the deficit would be nothing like it developed, and debt more broadly would be nothing like it developed. That was a play by a government that knew that it was on the ropes, the Howard government, and Peter Costello basically teased Labor into pursuing something that it probably shouldn't have. Could this be the same thing, given where the polls are at for this government? If they come out with massive income tax cuts and Labor doesn't want to have a big difference, like Kevin Rudd didn't want to in 2007, you might find yourselves agreeing with these cuts, winning an election, and then it becomes a poison chalice.
Let's see what they come up with. Let's see the detail that they put on the table.
But you must be aware of that risk.
Look, there's a whole range of risks that are put forward, particularly in terms of having to respond to a chaotic Abbott government and the way that they've been making decisions and the quality of the process. So I'd be very careful about, jumping at hypotheticals at this point when we don't have detail. You can absolutely, go through the past history, but I'll just wait and see what the detail is. I think fundamentally, and I for one believe we should always be looking at ways in which to keep taxation down. We are in a global, competitive market, particularly when you look at company tax. We did offer post-budget reply to work with the government on reducing company tax.
Have you guys had a real pie-in-the-sky sort of figure on that?
Well, but again, Peter, what you're trying to do is not have decisions like who would have predicted that Joe Hockey would come out in the way that he did today and make this announcement.
Yeah, but you can't say that their income tax cuts are unfunded and then have that pie-in-the-sky company tax cut.
Let me finish the point to come back to your earlier one. What you were saying is that's pie in the sky. Well, you need to have targets, you need to have something to aim for, and you need to have a bipartisan approach to get to those points. You want us to work on taxation reform, we put something on the table. Everything that we've put on the table, they've rejected. You can hit us on GST, you're right to, but we've got genuine concerns about what that does, particularly for people we represent.
I criticise them on super for the same logic, by the way.
But you need to be able to work together. So he comes out with this all of a sudden. We've had a taxation discussion paper out there. Don't know where he necessarily flagged all this within the context of that. This is the problem. Joe Hockey is this sort of the bubble gun. They're always popping out with ideas. He's always popping out with ideas. Remember when he talked about...
This is the year of ideas, in fairness.
Well, remember when he talked about potentially using super to fund for first home buyers their deposit. When we quizzed Treasury about whether any work had been done on that, questions on notice that I received on the House of Reps Economics Committee showed they hadn't even done any work on that. So let's see how serious they are about this latest thought bubble and whether it'll get them anywhere. All
right, you're the Parliamentary Secretary to Chris Bowen. You work very closely together, trying to put together the Labor Party economic plan for government. You're close as a factional colleague to him in New South Wales. What's the issue between him and Bill Shorten? It seems that they've already got those tensions that are often there between a Prime Minister and a Treasurer, and they're not even Prime Minister and Treasurer yet.
Well, you can... I always enjoy coming on your show and you throwing these things out.
You can answer the question. It's a legitimate question. Well, I mean, we've heard about things out of shadow ERC between the two, disagreements in relation to what approach to take in response to pensions and all the rest of it. Is that a healthy working tension between them?
They've got a great working relationship, and I frankly don't know where your question's coming from if you're just throwing it up in the air to have a bit of afternoon fun. I mean, Bill launched, Chris's book last week, The Money Men, available at all good bookstores, talking about the notable and otherwise contributions of 12 Australian treasurers. They talked... Oh, well,
there's another question. Okay, all right.
They talked openly. I mean, there will always be a competitive tension between leaders and treasurers, as there has to be, because the treasurers are always going to be keeping a tight rein on spending. But anyhow, I enjoy coming on your show for these interesting hypotheticals.
You raise Chris Bowen's book. I've got a copy. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But how does he have the time to write a book like that? Shouldn't he be fine-tuning Labor's message for the next election?
He's one of the most organised, thorough people that I know. It comes as no surprise to me that he does that. He's able to, and he has been working across a range of areas. When you look at the policies we put forward in terms of superannuation reform, multinational tax reform, the stuff that he's got the Treasury economic side of Labor looking at.
Can I just ask a quick question on that?
On innovation and technology
I've got to get you on
reform.
those earlier too. When you talk about the government doing something about the GST, you say it's not reform, it's just a tax hike. Then you refer to two examples of tax hikes around super and around multinational tax.
And changing the way in which we level the concessions, and that does have an impact on the way in which you manage superannuation.
I know it does, but equally the GST change does too. I mean, you've got to be, come on, Ed Husic, you're a straight talker. You know that you've just been pinged. You know you've just been pinged on this. It's politic talk, poly talk. You slam one side for the exact same thing on the other side.
No, because and if you look in terms of Chris's case, he's been thinking about issues relating to superannuation for a considerable period of time, and the way in which the reform, or that reform and the concessions are managed is pretty tricky. And so, it's more to it than just, hiking up a GST by 50%.
All right, I've got to ask you this before I let you go. The saga over the weekend involving Andrew Hastie, the Liberal candidate for Canning, in relation to the Fairfax revelations about the Taliban that had their hands chopped off by a soldier under his command. He had no line of sight. That's all been made clear. He's been cleared by the investigation. Two Labor MPs, frontbenchers no less, at a state level in WA, retweeted pretty unseemly tweets, quite frankly, by members of the public making light about this.
Absolutely are unseemly. Look, I've had those tweets brought to my attention, and it is frankly out of line, completely out of line to do that. And I think
they haven't taken the tweets down.
Well, I think the people responsible do need to take a hard look at themselves and do just that in terms of ordering the retweet. I think in this by-election, this crucial by-election, we don't need to focus on individuals. What we should focus on are the issues that matter to people that are going to vote in Canning, and most notably the fact that nearly 30,000 mining jobs have gone in the last 30 years. The state unemployment rate is nudging higher than the national unemployment rate, and the level of jobless, I think, has jumped about 2% in that time. These are serious issues for WA's voters. We do not need the distraction or the distasteful distraction that comes with some of the things that have occurred in the last 24, 48 hours. Investigations need to take their course. They're very difficult on the people involved, and I think ultimately we respect anyone who steps up to serve in the ADF. I've had enormous respect and do have for Mike Kelly, who is a former Member of Parliament, and I respect the contribution made by Andrew Hastie.
Yep, and in fairness, federal Labor colleagues of yours have all said the same thing. Bill Shorten, Nick Champion on Saturday when this news broke, Michael Danby earlier on to the point with Christina Keneally. It was state MPs, but it's good to hear you all universally condemning them. Quick final question before we let you go. On the seat of Canning, how large does the swing to Labor need to be, do you think, for Bill Shorten to hang on to his job?
I recall that in similar circumstances, Labor hasn't won a seat like this in similar circumstances since the late 60s, so I think it's extraordinarily tough. I think it'll be tough for the government as well, so it'll be a key by-election. I'm not going to pick a figure out of the air for you as much as I'd love to, because your track record with me and predictions, I often pay a price, so I ain't going to be doing that on your show. Thanks for the offer, though.
All right. Ed Husic, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Good on you, Pete.
All right.